Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher. I'm webcasting from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to find philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve some great problems in physics, in philosophy, in biology, and in psychology. I also hope to reach any of you who are wondering about the deepest nature of reality and our place in the universe. We live in the information age, but I find that few philosophers or scientists understand the nature of information. Information is neither matter nor energy, but it needs matter to be embodied, and it needs energy to be communicated over the internet, like this lecture. Information needs matter to be embodied in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the beginning of the universe 14 billion years ago. And if the stuff of the material world is just a fixed total amount, what can possibly explain all the evolutionary change that we see? The changes I will show are the information and the order in the universe, which has been increasing since the beginning of time, despite the second law of thermodynamics, which destroys order. The change is simply the arrangement of the atoms and molecules into what I call information structures, like the planets, stars, and galaxies. Now, stars are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces like gravity. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures under our own control. I'll show that we are just forms through which matter and energy continuously flow. And I'll show its information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. Information is the modern spirit, the ghost in the machine, the mind in the body. It's our soul, and when we die, it's our information that perishes. Only our matter remains. Okay, well, welcome to my second lecture, my second Monday lecture on great problems in philosophy and physics, which are based on my book, Great Problems, which, although it's available in a print-bound book, is also available to you on the internet at informationphilosopher.com. There you can download PDFs of the individual chapters. Now, one of the things I like to do when I write a book or organize a website is to break it up into specific problems, and problems lend themselves to being identified. For example, I have here the taxonomy I've prepared of what's in this book. And I'll just click over here for a minute and be able to look with you and show you that philosophy problems are on this side of the taxonomy, and physics and a couple of scientific problems like origin of life are on this side. And we're, in this opening lectures on great problems, we've been focusing on problems having to do with the mind. The mind will be a subject I'll take up in a complete book. I hope to start writing next year. At the moment, I'm on my fourth book on Albert Einstein, but mind is the next book. And it has very interesting issues associated with it, the famous mind-body problem, which we mentioned a little bit last Monday, and the so-called hard problem of consciousness. That term, hard problem, is David Chalmers' notion that there's something going on with our consciousness that he does not believe can be explained by reference to our material brain. If the idea is that the brain is reducible to the molecules, the atoms, and the physical laws which govern the control of the brain, and perhaps there are emergent biological laws, but if so, all of these would be indicating that what we are thinking or being conscious of is simply the product of what we have in our bodies and in our environment, and all those forces are impinging on us and causing us to think what we think, and the notion that we have consciousness, the notion that we are free, creative beings, may be, to philosophers of this bent, simply an enormous illusion. There's a way out of the problem for Chalmers, and that is that perhaps there is a mind-like entity that's a natural part of the universe for all time, a kind of cosmic consciousness, and we'll be discussing that a little bit. It's called panpsychism, that every entity, including atoms, molecules, elementary particles, have some participation in the notion of consciousness, which may be for David Chalmers the only solution to the problem of consciousness. Now, there are other issues, particularly mental causation, which is to say, can the mind move the body, which is mind-body problem, and can we understand where anything like that may come from? So, great problems, and today we're going to look at the problem of consciousness, and we particularly I would like you to introduce you to a way of thinking about the problem that I call the experience recorder and reproducer. Just take you a quick look at my blog, and maybe a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into the lecture itself. This is only my second week, and I'm struggling to organize the material on in my lectures, live streamed lectures, the same way I've organized the book into a taxonomy. So what we're looking at here is my blog at ifi.org, little small type for you to see that, but i-fi.org. And this is an announcement of today's lecture. So if we go backwards in time, this was last Friday, and I was able to put a significant description on that. And then I have here a link into that lecture last Friday. And I've organized it to show the book it's from. Friday will be this book, My God, He Plays Dice, How Albert Einstein Invented Most of Quantum Mechanics. And then on Thursdays, we'll have lectures on metaphysics. On Wednesdays, we'll always be taking our lecture from one of my many pages on philosophers and scientists. On a Wednesday, we did William James. And then on Tuesdays, we'll work from my book on free will. Again, I have the cover of that book here. And Monday, a week ago, we began with this hard problem of consciousness and the mind-body problem. So I'd like to continue with this today. But one of the things I want to tell you is that this blog, which here's a note that I'm just about to begin webcasting, this is going to be a wonderful tool, I hope, to organize all the lectures, because they'll be organized chronologically, which means over on this side, we'll have things like the link to today's lecture, which was just put up this morning, and all the other lectures. And then I need to do what's called tagging. And tagging is a real challenge, because if we can think of a consistent set of tags that agrees well with the individual problems we're facing, it'll be a lot easier for us to do. So let's see if I've found here a link to Information Philosopher, and I'll just drive from this point, Information Philosopher, and then I'll add /hashtags, and I'll show you a page where I'm trying to develop the idea that we could imagine a nice set of names for our keywords. Here my menu's pulling down. At this scale you get to see, for example, that my website is organized into, initially 20 years ago, I was working on 3 fundamental problems in philosophy, which I took to be, how do we know things? How do we know what exists in the world? And so forth. And then the problem of, is there any objective value in the world? Because our value systems, our ethical systems, our cultural norms have arguably always been drawn from our societies, which organized with ideas handed down to us by the tradition. And traditions usually were based most oftenly on religious considerations. And when I went to Brown in the 1950s, I was required as a physics student to take a lecture, a course in ethics, which was to teach me that science, the hard sciences, even biological sciences and many sciences, could not tell us anything about values, ethical problems. In the 50s, the argument was that all of our ethical values, our morals, come from teachings, which in the case of Christian America was thought to come down from the Bible. Judeo-Christian tradition dominated our society. But I always felt a little nervous about this argument that science could not say anything about values. For the simple reason, well, a nice quote was that Bertrand Russell used to say, "What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Today that would be humankind, of course. But I have always thought perhaps there could be values. And even in the last 50 years, we've seen a transition away from humanism as the source of values. That is to say, we're all humans, we're all equal, we should be equal under the law and equal in the eyes of God, when they taught it as a religious sensibility. But I thought we could get out of humanism, or we have done, I was saying, in the last few decades, with the notion that we should center our ethics in life on Earth and the Earth, sort of a terrestrial-based bioethics and so forth. And that's been an interesting development because it gives us a perspective outside of our human basis. And yet it didn't seem as if it was grand and large enough. So my goal was, under this value study, to come up with the idea of a good that is objective and existing outside of the planet Earth. That is to say, a kind of a set of cosmic values, which I put into this concept I call the ergo, the total negative entropy, or information in the universe. And so my third big category was free will. Freedom, it seemed to me, was critically important if we were going to act on our values. Some philosophers, the British philosophers, thought there were values in the universe because we've been teaching them, values in humanity, I guess I should say, and we had been teaching them for centuries, but they thought that the laws of physics suggested that we had no freedom to choose between different values. And on the other hand, the existential philosophers, Sartre and others, in Nietzsche initially, and perhaps even Heidegger, had this notion that we come into the world, we fall into the world, and we are in the world, and so our existence as a set of beings precedes any notion of values. And we develop those values, and we are free to develop those values. And if they are only developed by us, then there's a really serious problem, because, as Sartre put it, we would be in a world where we live in an absurd situation that we're free to choose, but it's an absurd freedom because all values are beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche put it. All values, we've invented them ourselves. So we have this interdependency, in my view, between both having a set of values that we can perhaps convince ourselves that we all should be paying attention to, and we have the freedom to pay the attention to them. So then in recent years, which is to say in the last 10 or so years on my website, I've added new problem areas. This drop down for the mind, which includes the things we're talking about today, like consciousness. And I added a drop down I'm still working on the importance of chance in the universe, on probabilistic laws and so forth, which I hope to develop into another book, perhaps my 6th or 7th book, if I live long enough and have the energy to complete all of that. And the next thing, which has been a big subject of my study, was the notion of the field in which I was trained. I got my PhD in quantum physics and astrophysics, and I have been very interested in a very large number of problems which are taught today as mysteries. The so-called collapse of the wave function, which, as we saw last Monday, is often associated with consciousness. In particular, the quantum physicists thought that when an experiment is done, this probabilistic wave function only collapses if a conscious observer is involved in the collapse, so that consciousness plays a role in quantum physics. Well, I doubt that very much and hope to work it out with you, and we'll do a lot in that. But let's come back now. You see, I want you to see that I'm trying to organize my website, and when I'm publishing these lectures, and in general, it's a good idea to use keywords in various ways. Today, since Twitter developed the notion of the hashtag 5-6 years ago, it's become a very interesting way to tag things. Facebook is now also recognizing tags, hashtags, and they're called hash because the pound sign is often described as a hash in computer techniques. And then words can be combined. If you need to have 2 words in a hashtag, you must not put a space or a hyphen or any other character in between them, but just run them together in what is called camel case. We have the uppercase, then uppercase, then uppercase for successive words throughout the hashtags. So here's a tentative list that I've just been developing, one under philosophy, one list under physics, and other ones for biology and psychology. And I'm saying that if we want to hashtag a thinker like Albert Einstein, we should just use the name that is used here. So here we are, I'm pointing to Jacques Derrida, and if I was to open Derrida for a moment, let's open him in a new tab and go away from hashtags. And we come over to Jacques Derrida, we would see that his address inside this website is simply his last name. Now, there are times when we have to distinguish last names of people who have the same, 2 people who have the same last name. And what I'm proposing there, as I do on the website, I have to differentiate Galen Strawson from his famous father, Sir Peter Strawson. And the way I do that is by pound Strawson and his first initial G on the end of his name. So much for a technique I'm using here with my website, but remember, I'm really hoping that I will get, whoops, I don't want the program dominating that. Let's go to here for a moment. Yes, and that doesn't seem to be working for us, so I'll just go to this view. That's a little better. How to get rid of that visual feedback, although it's sort of an interesting phenomenon. Let's go back to it for just a moment and notice that I'm feeding back the program into my wall monitor, and it has this interesting delay over time. There's a significant delay between the copy of each image that's put into the infinite loop going out. Okay, so I'm here on the topic of organizing all of my work and developing these keywords or hashtags. I've been very interested in this problem of a method that would allow us to tell that a certain web page was about a certain subject. This was a great dream of the inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. My son and I met with him back in the late 90s and talked about what his concept was of a semantic web. The web, he imagined, was loaded with meaning. But the question was, how do you know what a web page is about? This is a famous problem in library science. And I had worked in a library as an undergraduate at Brown, very interested always in library science, how we catalog books, how we categorize the topics, how we create subject headings, how the Library of Congress sets a set of separate categories. And before the Library of Congress really took the lead in the U.S., we had the old Dewey Decimal System. There were numbers on the backs of books, and that number said this book is in the subject of philosophy and the special subsection of philosophy called mind or something. What Tim Berners-Lee was thinking about was a method for allowing the web to have pigeonholes, little categories into which the pages could be classified. And it turned out it was a rather serious failure, and it never did work out. It would have required a great deal of people to agree on things. In those years, I worked on the concept of what I called a memetic web, where we would paste a meme ID into a page, and that would tell us what it was about. Let me just switch this where we are here for just a moment, since it's interesting for me to get your understanding of who I am and why you ought to pay any attention to memeticweb.com. Let's see if that's the right place. I think it perhaps needs to be, no, it's not going anywhere for us. Not sure what that's about. So maybe I'll have to take that out. Oh, it says it's trying to go somewhere, but maybe it can't find that site. Let's go back a bit more. I haven't looked at this site in some time. No. Let's just drop that for the time being. Come back to the idea that we're going to take these hashtags and we're going to put them inside our pages or inside our Twitter feeds, and perhaps in some way inside of Facebook. And I'm doing this partly because I would like those of you who want to read my work and understand the different parts of it, the different problem areas, and why we might make progress on understanding or even solving, quote unquote, those problems. You need to kind of understand that if you write about any of these problems, and I hope many of you will be able to tag them, which will say, give your readers references out to the rest of the web and allow your work to connect to other people's work. This is a big issue. You know, the World Wide Web, the Google search, has become one of our great educational tools. It's taking the place of going to libraries. It's sort of sad that young people today don't read nearly as much, I think, as my generation did, and we need to then put in place a way of getting them access to the knowledge that's there in the web. So I'm just trying to put up a lot of pages that are in the area of philosophy and science, but whatever area you're interested in, you'll find will be a lot richer if you could drive around in it by knowing you had keys, keywords, tags, meme names, which would allow you to jump from one page to another, which is what we do with our hyperlinks on my pages, so that you can drive through the knowledge base and around until you get comfortable learning. Well, today it's not reading on every pages, on all the pages. It turns out a great deal of it is simply watching YouTube videos. And it's for that reason that I decided it's time I started making live streamed programming, so you would be able to access my work by just watching it. And I hope, though, you'll go behind it when you need to get a deeper understanding of what we're doing. Okay, so today we're trying to get back to consciousness, and let's see if I can bring that one up. Here's my web page on consciousness. You see my drop downs and so forth. At the top of every one of my pages, you see it's above the word consciousness. We have what are called sometimes breadcrumbs, a trail back from the where we are to the home page. This particular machine I'm on right here that I'm showing you doesn't support looking at those links. So let me just drive here again, and can't quite do it. INF, enter. Here we go. Let's take a look at this, and let's drive to that page again. Imagine we travel across, and we have lots and lots of pages. We're interested here in mind and consciousness. And you see here, this is what I mean to point out, this is the breadcrumbs trail. So the whole website is organized with the information philosopher homepage at the top, and we can see that homepage here. Clicking on it and you're back to home. Then we're in the area called problems and the area called consciousness. Okay, so let's jump into the subject of consciousness and see what we can learn about it, and I'd like to connect it to a new idea about what it is to be conscious of some things that have always been problematic in philosophy. So to start with, let's look at what we just say at the top of this. I say consciousness can be defined in information terms as a property of an entity. Now, usually it's a living thing that we're talking about being conscious, but we can also include artificially conscious machines or computers. And just like we have artificially intelligent machines, I want to argue that in computer theory today, we can have an artificially conscious machine if it reacts to the information in the environment, or particularly react to changes in the information. And the simplest example of this is really a thermostat. So I point out here an animal who is an organism and has a lot of the attributes of consciousness that I'm going to associate with human beings is not conscious when it's in a deep sleep, because it ignores changes in its environment. And robots may be conscious in this sense, okay? Because even the lowliest control system, a thermostat, that uses negative feedback is in a minimal sense consciousness, that is to say, aware of exchanging information about changes in its environment. When the temperature in the room goes down, the thermostat notices it's below a set point, and it says, all right, let's use some negative feedback, and let's tell the furnace to turn on. And so the heat rises and rises and rises until the exceeds the desired temperature, and then it shuts the furnace off. Now that's called negative feedback, because there are other cases when the feedback is positive. That's what happens in an audio system and someone has a microphone on. I could demonstrate it by making a squealing noise right here. I won't do that. But the point is, when the feedback is positive, then when, say, a noise starts to appear, the concept of positive feedback is that noise goes back into the microphone again, and it gets louder and louder and louder and screams at us, and we've got positive feedback in an audio system. Now, this definition of consciousness is based more or less, I will try to introduce you to a model of the mind as an experience recorder and reproducer. The notion here is that whereas the standard model of the mind today is what's called a computational model. In cognitive science, the notion is that the mind is a computer. Now, I'm very negative about this idea because I think that people who think that our brains are computers and we are machines really don't know much about computers and I think we ought to say that I'd rather distinguish a machine-like cognition from the one that I have in this model I called an experience recorder. So typically computers have algorithms, stored programs that are needed, whereas we'd like to say that there are no stored programs, no pre-written algorithms by anyone, but everything that happens in the mind is a consequence of the experiences that mind has over time. Now, let's see if basically, imagine that we had a computer recorder that could, like a recording system for audio recording or video sounds, whatever, then it might be able to play back those sounds for us in a passive way. But now imagine that our brain is recording everything that's happening to us as an individual and into the mind. Remember, the brain is undoubtedly made up of matter, made up of atoms and molecules, very sophisticated molecules, macromolecules, long and so forth, and they are formed into biological units, which are our cells. All life that we are aware of on the planet today is made with cells, and the cells to have a coded algorithm of a sort in the DNA in the middle of the cell inside the nucleus. Before cells existed, there might have been a molecule that managed to duplicate itself, and if it duplicated itself and it just duplicated itself forever, that would have been not very interesting, or it could have been powerful. And as Jacques Monod pointed out, it's critically important to the evolution of life that somewhere along the line, the duplicating molecules made mistakes. And the mistakes then led to another, say, species of self-duplicating molecules, self-replicating, which could have been an improvement. Of course, they could have been a disaster and just did it a few times and disappeared. But if a variation, okay, if a mutation, if something changed in the little beginning process that knew how to duplicate itself, if the new version was faster, was better, it would out-reproduce the older versions. And there we have the essential two steps of Darwinian evolution, in which we have variation in the basic coding for the species, and then followed by natural selection. The new species might not succeed. But the old, the initial life form might find itself from time to time in a very changing environment, one that, as humans, we're very concerned about the whole Earth environment changing in the form, increasing its temperature with climate change. But even all over the planet, some areas of the world changed from what it was to something else. And if organisms in that little niche, little special part of the world had their environment change around them, it turned out to be very valuable for some of the newborns into that species to be different from the others. And that gave us the ability for them to adapt and reproduce as well as their ancestors used to do, but the ancestors might not be able to cope as well. So what we want to now do is say, imagine the simplest organism that could learn from its experiences or adapt to the natural environment by having something new going on. And in particular, imagine that our mind, which is made up of neurons, let's start with we should start with the simplest one. Let's say that there are experiences coming in, and experiences are made up of multiple senses. Now, in simple lowest organisms, they have a minimal number of senses working. Typically, they have a temperature sense, and they have a chemicals sense, which today would have grown to our taste buds, and taste is one of the very earliest senses in all organisms. So imagine that as we evolve to higher forms, even to animals, suppose the brain forms, or their neuron system forms, and when it has some new set of senses coming in, psychologists and all tend to focus on the sensory, the well-known ones, sight and sound and taste and touch and smell and so forth. But what if, when a new experience, or a newborn having an experience, what if when an experience comes in, besides the sensory, normal senses, 5 senses, what if that organism is in a state where it's very unhappy or upset or in pain? Imagine that then the storage of all of those senses and the storage of our feelings that we're having at the same time could then create a pattern of senses, of experience, which has been recorded. And the way in which it would be recorded will take us back to this screen for a moment, is what Donald Hebb, we need to be here, the neurobiologist Donald Hebb argued that the neurons that are connected initially are randomly connected, or perhaps not connected or just touching, but that the neurons that fire together because we're having an experience coming into us get wired together. And when they're wired together, then I can take that to the next step and say that any neurons that have been wired together in the past by experiences will fire together if any new experience comes in, which in even the simplest way might contain something that is part of or similar to part of the old experience we had earlier. And that would be what I call a reproducer of that entire old experience. So what I'm suggesting is, if just some of those wired together neurons were fired by a new experience, it could be because the ones that were part of the old experience are still connected together, and they all might fire. And if they did fire, we would have a sense, a reproduced experience in our minds that would tell us and remind us of what happened on the earlier time. This would explain many aspects of memory and the association of ideas, indeed. So I'm going to jump down and show you a picture of the neurons. Let's see, I think I don't have them in this page. I need my consciousness page, so let's go over here. And I think we may have something here down below. And maybe I don't. I guess I need my ERR page. So let's go here, see if we've got something more. There's our summary. Lots to read here, too much to read really, but here we are. This is a drawing of the levels in our cortex, okay? And here's an important distinction between us and computers. There's no computer that can so quickly, rapidly search and retrieve information as that of the human neocortex, the outer layer of our brains today, our human brains, because it has 10 billion neurons that are the axons, each one of which has 10,000 connections to other neurons. And it's extraordinarily complex. So what I'm saying is that, in fact, the model of the way our minds come to be what they are when we're fully formed. I mean, the mind is growing neurons into teenage, well into teenage, perhaps in young men in the 20s and 25 time period are still forming their connectivity possibilities. But remember, as these neurons all grow out and connect to one another, they have not had any experience recorded in them. So my information model of the mind is to say that there is a hardware capacity. You can think about it as the data storage capacity of a computer, or just the recording possibilities for other kinds of recording. And the actual recording of abstract information, which is not the brain in which it's recorded. It's not the matter itself, because as we know, our matter in our bodies changes with time. Some of our cells, like red cells, huge numbers of them, huge fractions of them are dead and gone, having been used up in minutes. Inside our bodies, something like 200 million red cells, which are the most functioning part of our blood flow, 200 million of them die every second. That means we have to reproduce 200 million of these red blood cells, inside of which there are these little complexes called the hemoglobin. Inside these, basically these are complicated enzymes. They're collections of amino acids that are all folded around in beautiful ways. And inside the middle of the many folds of this hemoglobin is an iron atom. And the iron atom is in a particular high energy state, which is being carried around to provide energy to everything we do. So in every one of the 200 million red blood cells, there are 300 million hemoglobin amino acids. So in order to reconstruct just one red blood cell, we have to rebuild this hemoglobin, which consists of 300 amino acids that are beautifully organized. So we have to multiply that 300 by the 300 million, and we're into billions of new hemoglobin, which are produced in our ribosomes. There's an amazing amount of replacement of failed matter, and the old matter is carried away and new matter comes in, and it takes energy to do all this work. That's why I describe a living thing like ourselves as a form through which the matter and the energy are flowing, and it's all being used to assemble our working information structures that keeps us alive. And thinking about it that way, you see that we are more information than the stuff, the matter in which our information is embodied at this moment. And most strikingly, although all the matter changes, certainly 90% of it is said to be replaced with new atoms in an order of 10 years or so, many times during our lifetime, the material Bob Doyle that's talking is entirely made up of new material. And yet I can still remember things in my memory which have been recorded, experiences recorded in my brain when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. So that's why I argue that we are not our matter, nor our energy. Instead, we are our information, because that's the lasting thing that's still here over our lifetime. Our information, as we learn it, our memories stay intact, not very perfectly. All of us, as we get older, can't recall a lot of what we wish we could. But our model of the mind then is that it is constantly experiencing the ordinary senses we think of, and accompanying those senses are emotional reactions to the situation we're in. And if the emotional reaction, when we've had an experience for the first time, was not a good one, then when we have similar events in the other ordinary senses, we might have reactions that are the result of our earliest recorded experiences. I think of the cases in which, for example, a young animal might had an experience where a yellow and black striped big animal came in and destroyed its parents, and the child escaped. And it could be there would be imprinted in such a mind a fear reaction the next time they see that yellow and black colors that were associated with a horrible event. To come to something more current, the notion of a post-traumatic stress syndrome could be that in the minds of veterans who've experienced horrors of war, vast explosions and so forth, are then conditioned so that now, after the war experience, they have something that resembles some part of their war experiences, like a loud noise, a bang, a car, or whatever, setting off a reaction, which is sort of unavoidable because inside their brain, the mind is playing back the experiences that were recorded earlier. I have one interesting, I think, example of that. Let's see if I can find it here. Try this one here. Right. Here's an example that I like, which was taken, a famous example. Marcel Proust wrote this very well-known, enormously important story, a set of books actually, called Remembrance of Things Past in English, or À la recherche des temps perdus, lost time. And what he describes in Swann's Way in the first volume is his story, which you can read on my website here on the ERR page. He describes how he'd forgotten everything about his youth when he was in a town called Cambrai. And he wondered why he couldn't remember all these things about the past. But there came a time, he says here, and maybe I should get it in the other window so I can select the range of what I'm talking to you about, but our own past, we labor in vain to attempt to recapture the past. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere, outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, pure mind, and the ordinary senses, in some material object, he thinks. And he has this notion that the material object could give it back to us should we run into it again, although that depends on chance, he says. So then he describes the particular event that I want to show you as sort of an example of our experience recorder. Many years had elapsed, he said, during which nothing of Cambrai, save what was comprised in the theater and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me. He remembered those issues, going to bed and his mother talking to him about various things. But when one day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then for no particular reason changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called Petite Madeleine, which look as though they'd been molded in the fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And soon, mechanically, weary after a dull day with the prospect of a depressing tomorrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the cake. No sooner had the warm liquid and the crumbs with it touched my palate than a shudder ran through my whole body, and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary changes that were taking place. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin, and at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory, this new sensation having had on me the effect which love has of filling me with a precious essence. Or rather, this essence was not in me, it was myself. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I was conscious that it was connected with the taste of the tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those saviors. He goes on to say, second mouthful and more, and it sort of faded away. But what happened here for him is that suddenly he remembers a very large number of the things that had happened back at the time when he was a very young man and when he first had this. See if I can find this section. So suddenly the memory returns. The taste was that of a little crumb of Madeleine, which on Sunday mornings I went to say good day to his mother or his aunt in her bedroom. She used to give him this same sort of Madeleine and the tea. And once I had recognized the taste, okay, the discovery of why this memory made me so happy, immediately the old gray house upon the street where her room was rose up like the scenery of a theater to attach itself to the little pavilion opening onto the garden which had been built out behind it for my parents. And he describes again and again all of the things that were hidden away in his memory came back when he took the taste of the little tea-soaked Madeleine. Here's a picture of the Madeleine, and you probably know them very well. So what I'm trying to build here is the idea that the reason we have experiences that are called subjective experiences is for the simple reason that all of us have had a very different set of experiences in our lives. So unlike a computer, which could be programmed to remember everything of its sensory nature, build it with a pattern recognition set of eyes, build it with the ability to touch and feel things in that sense, listen to sounds and so forth, because the computer would never have an emotional reaction to any experience, one can think of them a little bit more like the thermostat, which turns itself on, turns itself off, notices changes all the time, but doesn't have any sense of what it's like to be an organism like humans and other animals that have subjective experiences. The subjectivity then is because when a new experience is in front of us, we have a reaction to it. And that reaction depends on what we have accumulated in the form of past experiences, memories, and emotional, and here's the key thing, feelings, which give us our desires. If the experience we're in at the moment brings back pain, brings back bad memories, we probably don't like going in that direction. And that's true all the way down to simple things like a bacterium. The bacterium is very short of senses compared to human beings, but as I mentioned, it can notice temperature differences, and its primitive sense of taste, like our taste, is an ability to recognize as the bacterium travels through a medium, whether it's moving in the direction of something good, food, for example, or something toxic, poisonous, or whatever. And its behavior then becomes a reaction to its environment because it has had these experiences, or in the case of a bacterium, probably everything it has in the nature of its reactions to what's happening was given to it genetically, because every bacterium of a certain kind is exactly like the others. So we too, as humans, undoubtedly, some of our reactions to things are genetically imprinted. They've come through, for example, a newborn baby will react to a loud bang noise or whatever, and that's not learned. But that's so-called nature. But the nurture part of our who we are and how we feel is an accumulation of all the experiences we have during our lifetime. And because every person's experiences are different, our reactions to things, our feelings, and even arguably what the philosophers tend to call the qualia, the qualities of things that are not obvious, what it is like to see something red. They like to argue, well, maybe what you're experiencing when I'm looking at red, when you're looking at red is different from the experience I'm having, because there's no way to get inside the brain, inside the mind, inside the psyche, inside the individual. And that's a great problem in philosophy, which is connected to the problem of consciousness and the problem of what I'm describing as our experience recorder. Because the experience recorder is what gives us a reaction to a new experience that's not objective. We don't all have exactly the same reactions to the experiences that we're confronted with. The famous stories of, I have a friend who could not tolerate touching an orange because as a young child something horrific happened when she had her first orange. And my dad one time made us some chocolate bread pudding, which it seemed pretty innocuous. It was sweet, it was chocolate, it was dark, it was all made out of bread because we didn't have much in the house and then when I was a kid. But for some reason, I got very upset at that chocolate bread pudding. I couldn't stand it. And for years afterward, even relatively recently, when at a dinner party someone offered me bread pudding, which turned out to be delicious, but the mere fact of it being described as bread pudding was enough to get me a little bit of a gag and a feeling, oh, I'm not sure I can. I used to be able to vomit and feel like I was upset. My stomach was upset just by thinking about bread pudding. And I thought that's a strong example of how our minds have the ability to reproduce our emotions and our feelings. And what Thomas Nagel says, that none of us can know what it's like to be a bat, was the famous essay, his work, because none of us can know what it's like to be another. Well, I think I basically am giving you an argument of what it's like to be is built up and is subjective because it is the accumulated experiences that we've had throughout our lifetimes that lead us to be conscious in a way that no robot can be conscious, no thermostat can be conscious, but it's a consciousness that comes out of our own life experiences, like Marcel Proust tasting the little Petite Madeleine and having a swarm of memories come back to him that had been lost without the context of the combination of things that happened when he was a child. So thank you for listening today, and I'll remind you that tomorrow we're going to go on to look at our problems in free will, and I'll be working from this book, which has a quite different organization and a set of categories and set of particulars of all of the problems. And I hope that I will be continuing to develop my argument for hashtags, for keywords, for a way that you can use to collect the knowledge on a particular problem that you might be very interested in. I hope today I find a very wonderful collection of videos like the ones I'm doing, some of them beautifully illustrated, beautiful graphics behind, wonderful animations. I wish I could do that kind of work myself, or find an animator who will help me to do them as I try to teach you different things. But there's a huge amount of stuff out there, and it needs to be organized. Wikipedia does a wonderful job of organizing it for the most part. You search for a phrase, and if you're lucky, you'll get what you really need to learn. But tomorrow we'll do free will, and then on Wednesday we'll come back to a choice of another philosopher, perhaps a colleague of William James that we did last Wednesday. Thursday we'll be on metaphysics, and Friday we'll be back to Albert Einstein. This is the book I'm working on now. It looks like it's ready to go to the press, but it actually has only 17 chapters are complete, and they're on my website at informationphilosopher.com/books. And you can go and read these initial chapters if you're interested in where I'm going with that problem. One of many that I hope to work on and talk to you about when you come back to the Information Philosopher in the future. Thanks very much for the time you're spending with me. Appreciate it.